So good afternoon. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. So today we're going to talk about grounded theory in action, and I wanted to use some examples to actually talk about grounded theory, because grounded theory is one of the most complex qualitative research methodological approaches that people can use. So before I get started, I just want you to take some time to read through the land acknowledgement, and then we'll get started. I'll just leave a minute for that. So today we're going to talk about the key characteristics of grounded theory, talk about some of the methods that people use. I'm going to talk about the classic methods that you will find traditionally in all grounded theory approaches. And I'm going to present an example of grounded theory in action to sort of help bring the concepts to light, and then open it up for questions and answers. So what is grounded theory? And I generally start off, I'm a bit whimsical in nature. And if you think about Alice in Wonderland, she fell down a rabbit hole and she went through all these diverse experiences. And along her journey, she met diverse people. She had interactions with diverse objects. And based on her interactions and the relationships she made coinciding decisions to sort of get her out of the situation she was in. And as I go through and talk about grounded theory, I want you to think about Alice in Wonderland and how she discovers her own path. Because in grounded theory, it is a discovery process. And many of the philosophical underpinnings of grounded theory are related to, I guess you will align with Alice's experience. So I just want you to keep that as you go along. So grounded theory arisen out of the works of Glaser and Strauss. And on to the left, you have Barney Glaser, who's considered the godfather of grounded theory. And actually, Dr. Glaser just passed away this year. And his work, he started off with Strauss. And both of them actually developed and did the book Discovery of Grounded Theory in 1967. However, there's a lot of debate in the literature. They actually parted ways. And even though both of the gentlemen had high respect for each other, if you read the literature surrounding grounded theory, they get in so much as into an argument that Glaser actually says to Strauss, look, you need to pull your book off the shelf and we can have a discussion about it and then maybe republish it. But the main difference between Glaser and Strauss was related to where you go into the literature for grounded theory. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we proceed. But Glaser would say that if you're doing grounded theory, then you don't need to have an in-depth analysis of the literature. You just need enough of the literature to be what he terms as theoretically sensitive to the issues. And Glaser would say, as you go through your grounded theory research, you would go back at certain times and revisit the literature depending on what's coming out of your grounded theory. Strauss, on the other hand, says you really need to get into the literature. You need to know what's been said, what's been written, and that will really guide where you go in the entire process. Another way that they diverge is Glaser is more, and I am more in the line with Glaser. He's a bit more whimsical. He trusts the data and says, let the theory evolve, let the data guide you. Strauss, not so much. He has more processes in his coding, and he gets more into verifying what is said and why and how. Whereas Glaser would say, you know what, let things emerge, let the data guide you, and let's see where we go. And he's more of an inductive methodologist. And then we have to the far right hand, we have Kathy Charmaise. So in comparison to Glaser and Strauss, who were both considered themselves post-positives, and I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide, Kathy Charmaise is a social constructivist, where she says that the researcher is a co-participant in the research study. Whereas Glaser and Strauss take a step back and they say you need to be as objective as you can possibly be within the parameters of the study. So that's just an overline of the three main I guess, players when you talk about grounded theory. So Glazier, he has a sociology degree at Columbia, and his work really sparked from his work done in the 1960s on death and dying. And of course, as I said before, his book, The Discovery of Grounded Theory, which he actually developed with Strauss, and he is a post-positive. And when we talk about post-positivism, what we're referring to is that you appreciate that there is an objective nature to reality, but science and objectivity can not truly be measured. And the example I like to use is that what is true today may be based on what is known today, and may be based on what scientific discoveries we have today, but that may not be true for tomorrow. So we think about there are multiple realities which cannot truly be captured or truly be measured, but you know what, we have to consider what we know at the moment. And as a post-positive, Glazier and Strauss both look at how people interact and the relationships they build with other people. So if you look at this slide, you know, people are going towards one path, but along that path, there's different notions of how to get there, and it may change and shape. So the philosophical underpinnings of grounded theory is pragmatism and symbolic interactionism. And both of those perspectives, they look at how people make decisions and healthcare choices based on their interactions with themselves, with others, and with objects. So it's the meaning that they assign to these interactions. And if you look at the picture right here, we have a woman and we have a man, where the woman looks at this tree and what she sees is somebody laying down, having a picnic, having a great time. Whereas the gentleman looks at, hey, I'm allergic to spiders, I'm not going there. So both of them assign different meanings to the actual tree. And another good example is if you take the Canadian flag and you put it in a country, you know, in the South Pacific with a population of say 500 people, and you put a Canadian flag there, they may look up at the flag and say, it's some kind of leaf, but I don't know what it means. But you have a Canadian flag and you're driving down Prince Philip Drive, we automatically recognize it as a sense of autonomy, a sense of freedom, a sense of goodwill and welcoming, like Canada. So it depends on the experience that people have and how they contextualize those experiences and assign meanings to them. So grounded theory is a qualitative research process that looks at generally areas or phenomena that are not well studied and very little is known. And it moves from an actual description of what's happening. It actually describes what we call a basic psychosocial process. And when you think about a basic psychosocial process, it's a process that unfolds over time. And as a researcher, I usually have sort of like a temporal aspect to the way I do research. I always look at what it was like for someone to grow up, what was it like someone to cope with a disease or an illness or a situation, and how they look at and manage it in the future. So it is a process that unfolds over time and is actually contingent on different perceptions and interactions and engagements with other people. And a hallmark of grounded theory that is actually grounded, we say, in the data and the contents of participants' lives. So you're actually collecting, for the most part, generally speaking, is participant stories and people's experiences. And you want to get the context, and you're actually taking their quotes. When they say it's grounded in the data that you're actually collecting are the quotes. And as I noted before, it's very inductive, and the theory evolves as data is collected and analyzed simultaneously at the same time. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that in the next couple of slides. And grounded theory is the only qualitative research approach that you will end up with a theory at the end of it, and a substantive theory, which means that it's specific to the area of the phenomenon that you're studying. So we don't go in with a theoretical framework. The actual theory evolves at the end, which is really really cool in many essences, because you know you can actually use these theories to inform healthcare policies or develop mission statements or vision statements, or to have the underlying foundation of programs. So the types of questions that you'll see with a grounded theory is looking at people's experiences across a continuum of time, a continuum of social processes and their interactions. And it helps us understand how people understand a phenomena and how their subsequent healthcare behaviors unfold, or how people make decisions based on their understandings or their experiences with others. So my research question that I had developed was, what are the experience of individuals living in a family at risk for, a big long word, arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy, or ARVC, in the province of Newfoundland as they move through the genetic testing process? So in short, I was looking at the experience of people who were at risk for this genetic condition in Newfoundland, and as they moved before the genetic testing, during genetic testing, and afterwards. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the ARVC. ARVC is a genetic linked autosomic disease, which means that you have 50% chance of giving it. Primarily affects young males, age 40. And the typical person would be, you know, if you hear on the news, a gentleman had dropped down during playing hockey at the arena. And the thing about ARVC is that the primary first symptom may be sudden cardiac death. So it's a condition that is predominant in Newfoundland. Some people, you know, the real true risk is not known, but people estimate it to be 1 in 1,000, but it depends. At the time of my study, we had like 15 families that were ARVC families, and it has increased to about 23, maybe more at the moment. But what's concerning about this condition is that, as with all genetic conditions, it's not just takes place to one person, is that it goes through generations and generation and generation. And of course, you know, the horrific outcome could be sudden cardiac death. So the main treatments for ARVC is medication, so medical management. Some people can have a heart transplant, of course, if available. And the hallmark treatment is the implantable cardiac defibrillator, which is a device that goes underneath the chest wall and attached to the heart. And what the ICD does is prevents a lethal arrhythmia or lethal heart rhythm, which is the main cause of death for ARVC. So it's a problem with the electrical conductivity of the heart, as per se. So as I was saying, just to orientate to my question, I was looking at the experience of people living in a family at risk for ARVC and how they awakened to the notion they were at risk, how they made decisions to engage in a genetic testing process, and how they lived with their decision and as they move forward. So again, you can see that I'm looking at a psychosocial process as it unfolds. So in grounded theory, you use semi-structured interviews, and the interview questions will get shaped and reshaped as you move along. For example, if you're in an interview and someone brings up something completely different, you would actually devise a question and take that to the next interview and ask the subsequent person, is this the case for you? Did you experience this? Generally, it's about 20 to 40 participants. I had 29 participants in my study, but again, in grounded theory, the number of participants is not predetermined. And again, as well, it will get shaped and depending on the theory that's arising. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I get down to theoretical sampling. And of course, it's the phenomenon of interest. And in this case, it was ARVC and genetic testing process. You usually use like target, purposeful sample, convenient sample, and snowball sampling, which is basically word of mouth, or somebody who's been recruited for the study will tell their families and friends. And I actually had a lot of people recruited by snowballing. And a classic hallmark of grounded theory is theoretical sampling and data saturation. So in theoretical sampling, you continue on collecting / recruiting participants until no further themes emerge from the data. And as I said, similar to the semi-structured interviews, if when you're doing your data analysis, if something new arises, then you can select participants based on that new information. A good example was in my research study, when I was interviewing participants, many of them talked about the role that their family played in helping them manage their experience through the genetic testing process, how to help them cope, how to help them make decisions. So as I started off with individuals at risk for AERVC, I actually expanded my sampling to include family members or significant others in the sample. So I had actually 8 spouses as well, in addition to my actually people at risk for it. And you continue on getting your sample until data saturation occurs, or as I said before, there's no further new information coming up. So for me, my recruitment was through the Provincial Medical Genetics Clinic with a clinical geneticist, and I used snowball sampling. I also used theoretical sampling, and as I was recruiting, I recruited what we refer to as a negative case. So a negative case is a case that is sort of goes against the grain. It's considered sort of like an outlier case. And the importance of having a negative case is you want to sort of test and see if your theory holds up. So considering the most outlying case, does your theory explain what's happened, describe what is happening? So in my case, I had one person who actually had an implantable cardiac defibrillator put in for ARVC, had it taken out, and then had a cardiac event and had it reinserted. But when I analyzed the data, the experience, even though it was different, the theory that was generated held up and still explained the experience of the negative case as per se. So in grounded theory, it's really important to look for that negative case, but it's also equally important to have variation in your sample, meaning diverse ages, diverse gender, and diverse ethnicity, diverse cultures, and diverse geographical plans, so urban and rural. And if someone is evaluating a grounded theory study, they're really going to look for that depth and breadth and variation in the sample. And that actually adds credibility to the study as well. So for my research study, I had 15 ARVC positive individuals. I had 5 ARVC negative, and I had 8 spouses. And I also have a combination of urban and rural regions across the province. So I had a really nice, diverse sample. So I just wanted to show you some of the classic interview questions, because quite often that comes up is how do you phrase your interview questions when you're doing a grounded theory study? And what I did was, again, taking that sort of across the lifespan approach. I started asking people, tell me about growing up in your family. Did you know anybody sick? How did you become aware of the possibilities of some genetic condition in your family? And how did you become aware of your potential for having ARVC? So if you remember, a classic Glazier approach is what I took, is that Glazier would say you need to have some sense of the literature. And this question actually was based some part on the literature, in fact, that people make decisions about their risk related to their personal theories of risk. For example, if you grew up in a family with multiple people dying around you, you probably had some inclination that something was just not right. But if you grew up in a family where nobody was dying, then that probably wasn't on your radar. So I wanted to see how people's personal theories of risks unfolded within the context of ARVC and where they actually entered the genetic testing process. And I'll talk a little bit about that on my next slide. So then I got the awakening piece right here. So then I want to go into what it was like actually during the genetic testing. So what it was like to have to wait for genetic testing, And then could you please tell me about your decision to participate or not in testing? So here I'm trying to really tease out how did they understand and assign meanings to being at risk and make their co-assigning decision, which if you think about it, is really in line with pragmatism and symbolic interactionism. Then I move into, after you received your test results, what were your thoughts? So now I'm getting, how are you coping with it? What does your life look like? What is your future? Has this experience changed your life or the way you look at it? And a good little cheat in when you're doing interviews is that when you ask questions like, can you tell me about when you became aware of the possibility that you have a genetic linked condition? It's always good to say, can you provide me an example? Who was around at the time? Where did you receive the information from? What factors played in? Or you could say something like, can you tell me about when you sat down with your family and things that went through your mind when you were making the decision to have genetic testing or not? So asking them to give exemplars is a really great way to really delve into what the experience is. So as I noted before, data analysis and grounded theory, you do data collection and data analysis simultaneously. So as you're going and collecting your interviews, it's really important to take a pause and immediately afterwards transcribe it and then read through it again and again and again. And quite often what I do is I will read through the transcript and I will check it against the taped file. And as you're going through it and you start your data analysis, new questions will arise. And as you read through each one and as you go through each interview, you may say, hey, I would need to ask a new question, but I also need to recruit a person with a different experience. So that's where like your theoretical sampling will come into play. And as I said before, it's very complex and I can't express how messy it is. So it generally is a very seasoned researcher, one or two, paired with a novice researcher, particularly if it's a PhD student that goes through the data analysis process. And it takes, to do good data analysis, it's like 4 to 6 months because you keep going back and forth. And as you're doing it, you're using the technique of constant comparative method, which means you're comparing interview to interview. You're comparing segments of each interview to segments of the next interview and the next one and the former one. So you're going into that, especially if a new concept arises, you want to go back to the previous interviews and say, hey, did I miss that? Did that come here somewhere? And then as you move forward, you want to explore, do other people experience this? Do other people experience this? So it's that maneuver and the constant comparing of the data that makes it so messy. And we talked a bit about theoretical sensitivity, but the point I want to make here is that if you come into a situation where there's something, you feel is off in left field, it's okay to go back into the literature and read up on that so that you're aware of the issue. So when you do the next interview, you can probably bring some of these issues to light. As I went through my data analysis, I was very in tune to my own preconceived notions. And I tried to remain as objective as I could be as a researcher. So I spent a lot of time memoing and taking notes. So alongside my transcripts, I would write, like you would see me written right there, and I would write down and scribble, this is my idea, I think this is going on. And then I would make decisions around if I found something in the interview, and I would quite often put an asterisk next to it, say, I need to consider this as I move forward in the next interview, or I need to go back and review the literature on this piece. And I also developed interpret summaries, which is basically synopsis of the interview with key ideas and quotations. And I would send it back to the participants and say, did I capture your story? Is there anything that you feel I missed? And then that would give another opportunity for participants to engage in the research process, and it adds credibility and trustworthiness to your data. I spent considerable amount of time diagramming. So I drew pedigrees to look at the relationships between the people that I were interviewing, because quite often, they were cousins, aunts, and uncles. I also did the history of ARVC from its inception right to the discovery of the ARVC gene, and I'll show you that next. And I did the history of the Canadian healthcare system. So at one point in my office, I had a big long timeline of the key things around the Canadian healthcare system with respects to right from the conception of the word risk right on up to today. Today I would have COVID in there, of course. And then I had the history of ARVC. So I could really contextualize when people discovered or entered the genetic testing process alongside of what was happening actually in society, in health, I should say more so. And then that gave me more insights into how to contextualize the findings. So just a quick snapshot of a timeline for ARVC. And I wanted to bring this to your attention because if you look in the 1970s, that's when the first documented history of sudden cardiac death in Newfoundland was reported. And then as we go through, there's three key junctures along the time. So like in 1990 was the Human Genome Project. In 1994, there was a US research team came to Newfoundland and actually collected blood samples from people at risk for ARVC and actually exited Newfoundland, and we really didn't get full benefit of the results. And then we have in 2005, haplotype testing was done for ARVC by under the team of Dr. Terry Lynn Young. And here, when you think about haplotype analysis, Kathy Hodgson actually gives a really nice example, is that we knew the cul-de-sac that the ARVC gene was on, but we didn't know the house. And then, of course, in 2007, we had discovery of the ARVC gene. So if you take a step back and where I have the hearts put there, that's where I had participants from different times along the trajectory of the discovery of the ARVC gene. So if you can think about being a woman in 1983, where they thought, you know, they were thinking about ARVC was primarily a male dominant disease and didn't affect women, you would think that you were safe. So you probably wouldn't be concerned about have genetic testing for that or not. But if you were in 2005, 2007, then when there was actual tests that could actually tell you if you were at risk or not, then you probably were more in tune. Another thing to think about, you know, back in the 1990s, people were living in these families where people were dying all the way around them. So they were more in tune to having genetic testing. Whereas in 2007, you know, people didn't see all these people dying because there was, you know, you had the ICD was a proven treatment in 2005. So there was, you know, some ways that you could actually save this population as per se. So I got a diverse population with diverse experiences and looked at how they interact with their stage of science as per se and their experiential knowledge and how they made decisions about entering the genome testing process. So it gets really messy when you start playing around with different dates and different experiences and people in general. But this study was particularly, I would say, a bit messy. So how do you code all this? So there are three key steps. The first one is substantive coding, where you do open and selective. And then you have what I call the higher level coding, when you start to get up to your big theoretical constructs, or what people refer to as your big themes. And then you generate your theory. So when we get into open coding, we actually start off by doing line by line codes. So you transcribe into written text, and generally what I do is I put my written text in one line in a table, and then I have blank over here so I can actually do my codes. So code is a conceptual label that really captures what's happening or what's being said. And quite often in branded theory, we use jargons or INGs. And then you build up from the codes, you collapse your codes into subcategories, into categories, into and into theoretical constructs, and in the theoretical constructs, you have an overarching label. But if you think about this process, give an example. So activity is one of the things that people were thinking is sparked an increase in your heart rate and could cause or exacerbate a onset of a cardiac event and lead to associated with ARVC. So quite often people, this cohort, would talk about restricting things. So they would talk about stopping exercise. So if I was reading through a line by line and someone said, I stopped my exercise, I would code it as stopping exercise. And other codes would be like limiting activity, fearing exercise, or avoiding shopping. So if you took those 4 things, stopping exercise, limiting activity, fearing exercise, and avoiding shopping, if you merge them together, you probably could come to a category about avoiding activities of daily life. And then if you had another category that talked about social isolation, you could collapse the activities of daily living and socialization into one main category, would be coping with risk of ARVC. So what happens is that your codes go to subcategories, goes to categories, and then the categories get shaped and they get collapsed. So data is being constantly moved around for the best fit of where it belongs. And as you go and you start to populate your categories, you start to describe them and their properties. You're looking at who, when, where, or how. So you're getting these very vivid descriptions of the data. And as you start to get your main categories, there becomes a common idea. We call it about a common core variable. What connects them all together? What is the main thing? And as I went through my study, my core variable was constructing one sense of risk. So all their actions and everything they did was all surrounded by how they assign meanings to being at risk and what that meant for them. And based on how they assign meanings to being at risk, then they had subsequent actions and responses and healthcare behaviors, which again is really linked to the philosophical underpinnings of symbolic interaction and pragmatism. So I jumped ahead of myself a little bit. So after you do that grassroots open coding, taking quotes and assigning the actual conceptual labels or the codes, and then you start to do selective coding, and you go through again through all the categories, and then you start saying, move things around and say, where does it go and how does this relate to risk? So you're essentially describing risk. And then you saturate your categories until no new properties or anything else, no categories or themes emerge. So that's what we refer to when we call data saturation. Then we move into the higher level coding. So you're putting it all back together, and then you start to make the links between the categories, and you're coming up with big theoretical constructs. And that's what Glaser refers to, starts to expand everything. You have a lot of categories, and then you start to pull them back together and then start to build up to define and describe what the psychosocial process is under examination. So this is just a nice little visual I thought that would help really explain some of the messiness that I've tried to explain. So here you have your codes, okay? So here we could have like different types of shopping, restricting shopping, restricting exercise, fear of exercise. These would all collapse to a subcategory, and then you could have a number of codes over here to a subcategory. They collapse to a category, and the same unfolds. Okay, so here we have 3 categories, numerous subcategories, numerous codes. And then during this process, the core variable starts to emerge, which was for me was risk. And at the end, in the theoretical coding, we're actually collapsed the categories together to be a theoretical construct. So you can see how inductive the process is. Messy, but inductive. So to best illustrate this, I thought I would just show you my 3 theoretical constructs. So the first one I had was awakening to a new meaning of being at risk. So that captures the first part, growing up in your family. When did you become aware that you might be at risk? The second one was deciphering the meaning of risk. That's how people understand the risk, how they label it, how they label the objective or understand their objective versus subjective risk. And the third one is constructing a new meaning of being at risk. So how they move on in the future. So it's the interaction of all three of those that reflects the core category, constructing a sense of being at risk. So here again, here's my actual take. I'm just going to look at construct one as awakening to a new meaning of being at risk. And you can see that I have two categories. Category one, making sense of numerous losses. So that really captures, the number of people that are actually dying around you and why they're dying and how people understood that. And category two was struggling to break the cycle of uncertainty. So here you go. And below here, you have the properties of the subcategories. So just a quick snapshot. And here people are saying, what is this? So this is my final model or my theory that came out of it. And I just want to just bear with me for a minute, because if you think about a Rubik's Cube has three axes. So one of the axes I labeled scientific knowledge, or the state of science at the moment, or the state of ARVC discovery. Because if you remember from my timeline, people entered the genetic testing process at different times when different types of knowledge was available. For example, haplotype knowledge. And then my population, it was so diverse, they had so much different experiences. Some of them lived in families where people were dying all around them, and this was not the case for everybody. And then this final axis was the phase of the genetic testing process, pre, during, or post. Because I had people that were entering it, people who were actually in it, and people who were post and telling you about their reflecting back on their experience. Most of the people I had actually were reflecting back on their experience. So if you think about a Rubik's Cube, and I don't know if you can see this one here, but depending on where science was at the time, your experience knowledge, and where you were in the phase of your genetic testing process, everybody's Rubik's Cube looks different, because everybody's experience are different, and the context in which they unfold is totally different. So here is my final overall model for the three theoretical constructs. And if you look again, you got the scientific knowledge juxtaposed with people's experiences and where they are in the genetic testing process. But in the cube, you actually have some of the factors that influence how people understand this whole experience. For example, their interaction with experts and experts' knowledge and care. People recounted stories of going to their healthcare provider who didn't have a background knowledge in ARVC, and that made a difference how they interpreted, their sense of risk. Age and ARVC primarily impacted people, males and 40. So if you were a female and you were 29, you may not have seen your risk back in 1990 as high as what you see it now, because we do know it affects people at a younger age, and it can affect both men and women. And that gets back to the stage of science as well. And of course, physical signs and symptoms. There could be people who were ARVC negative, but if they have signs and symptoms of, say they get short of breath, or they're working out and they feel their heart is going racing, for a moment, they have, I wonder if science was not right. Because if you think about it, over the time span of development of genomic, predictors or genomic knowledge, science has shifted and changed. We're not always right, and it's not absolute. So what is true 10 years ago may not be true today. And another thing that, and I'll leave you with this as well, is at-risk relative. So people looked at their personal theories of risk. And a classic one is that if you think about cardiac disease and ARVC, if you were a young female and worked out, you didn't fit the profile of someone, particularly with ARVC, or what people refer to as a typical coronary candidate: male, obese, smoker, having a few drinks. So you didn't fit that stereotype because you probably worked out, eat healthy, but people weren't in tune to the genomic component of it. So that's a bit of insight about that. And so just to close off, when you talk about qualitative research methodological approaches, we talk about trustworthiness of the findings. And grounded theory, and I think in the seminar series, you looked at different types of research methodological approaches, but grounded theory is one of those that has their own criteria. And it's unique in that way. We talk about fit, relevance, work, and modifiability. And I'm just going to just give you the Cole's notes on each one of those. So the fit is how the data fits together. Do the quotes, sorry, I should say, are the categories supported by the subcategories, the subcategories supported by the codes, and the codes supported by the quotes. So when you're reporting it, is that nice logical sense? Do the categories collapse to build theoretical constructs? It doesn't make sense. And in relevance, it means what did the researcher do to put the preconceived notions aside? And as you noted, I developed memos, I did an audit trail, I did interpretive summary, and work refers to, does the theory fit together and explain, describe, predict somewhat about what happens? And using theoretical sampling and using a negative case and using variation is really key to that. And modifiability, does it capture the range of people's experiences? Does it hold up? And that's where the negative cases I talked to before, does it explain the outlier case and it hold up true? So that's just a brief synopsis into grounded theory. And I'm just going to open up to some questions about the research process or about my research in general.
Okay, thank you for that great presentation and for sharing your research with us. Does anyone have any questions? Go ahead, Paul.
Thanks, April, for this overview. I found it helpful, and I just have a question about what you've been calling the negative case. How does that work in practice? Like, what defines a negative case, and how would you interview them? Like, for example, I'm understanding a negative case as someone who doesn't have ARVC, but maybe I'm wrong. What is that? What is the negative case?
Okay, so the negative case was somebody who had ARVC, but took a different path. So generally, when you have ARVC, people want to have the implantable defibrillator. But this individual had a defibrillator, and for personal reasons, had it removed.
Okay.
So that's not the normal trajectory of what happens. So it's sort of like the outlier case.
Okay. So somebody who's different from the way you've organized your people that you're interviewing,
or the way that people have organized their thoughts.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it only takes a different path.
Yep. Okay.
It doesn't follow the normal, I guess, the path of normality as per se, and becomes a little bit of an outlier. But I wouldn't necessarily interview them any differently. Okay. I may add in one or two questions, but when you go back to do your data analysis and you start to build your categories in that, the key thing is, can the theory explain this person's experience under umbrella in tandem with the other people?
Right. Okay.
That's why the breadth and depth is the diversity of your population in grounded theory is really one of the things that reviewers are looking for.
Okay. Okay. That's great. Thank you.
I've got another question from Christy. She wants to know, when would this method not be used or appropriate?
When would it not be used? It wouldn't be used if you wanted to do just purely description, and you use interpretive descriptive there. And if you weren't looking at the overall process from the trajectory of the life, if you just want to focusing on a certain time period. So like you would use interpretive descriptive you would use qualitative descriptive for just perceptions, and qualitative descriptive is more just pure descriptive, like when, what, where, who, or how. Phenomenological inquiry, you do look at experiences in that, but it's more of an in-depth analysis, and they look at existentialism. And they're really looking at a more in-depth, and you actually, in phenomenologic questions, it's not unusual to interview someone, like you can interview them 4 or 5 times, and there's smaller numbers because you do so much in-depth interviewing. The other research methodological approach is ethnographic study, when you're actually focused looking at culture.
Okay. Anybody else have a question? No.
But it is a really complex, messy, and very rigorous approach, and very outlined. It takes a long time to do.
Okay, I don't know if anyone can hear me. I think I'm frozen.
And I think, like, if I was going to give anyone advice about doing the grounded theory study, I would think about your team really, really importantly, and that variation, and being able to justify and rationalize why you're making choices, particularly around your theoretical sampling. And some people, you can actually use software to help you manage, not analyze the data. Like I used In Vivo to help me house the data and to connect it all together.
Okay. Oh, do you see the next question?
Yeah, what would be an optimal team composition? You need to have someone who's done grounded theory a couple times. And I would actually have, you need to have someone who's really grounded, I would say grounded in the research methodological approach and in the sample. So you need to have a good methods.
Okay, there's another one.
Do we do grounded theory when there's no existing theory? Yes, yeah, absolutely. So in grounded theory is when there's little known about a phenomenon, or you're taking a different look at it. Are there ways to engage patients? And yes, actually, I did a second grounded theory study with the hearing loss community. And I actually had members from the hearing loss community as a patient advisory committee that helped me to construct the research questions, the recruitment process, because I do not have hearing loss. So they were very instrumental in that. They actually helped me as well in the assistive hearing devices, and they were involved in the knowledge translation activities. So I had a full engagement for the hearing loss community.
Wow, I got lots of questions today. Any more?
I don't know if that's I did a good job or a bad job, but I'll take it I did a good one.
No, I think it's good. It's a good thing.
I think you did a great job. Thank you. I enjoyed it a lot. This is Katie. I asked a couple questions. When you said that they helped with the knowledge translation process, can you expand on that and provide like what specifically, what were their roles and how were they able to work with you on that?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So 2 quick things and then more of a longer thing. 2 things that I did is I actually had them present at a national conference with me. And they're actually cited, on the research publication. So they help with that. And they have insights into proper language to use. And as I said, like I am a novice when it comes to hearing loss when I started the study, and I wasn't sensitive to the language and the needs of that population. But if you go to the Canadian Hard of Hearing Association website, we actually developed a toolkit to help people with hearing loss, because the stigma around hearing loss is something that happens to older people, but it's not the case. Quite often people have hearing loss prior to getting help. People actually go 10 to 20 years without getting help. So we wanted to have some key message that be proactive about your hearing loss and don't wait. And it can happen to anyone. So we wanted to put it in a positive light as avoid the stigma that hearing loss is something that happens to old people, which is quite often the perceptions. So we developed a an interactive online, I would say, module that you can actually go into and then enter it depending on if you are a younger person, like a teenager, middle age with a family, or an older adult, and you can enter and get different resources. But the key message is the same: be proactive about your hearing loss and get tested. And the delivery of that information and the content was totally enmeshed with the patient advisory committee. And I also had an audiologist on as well. And the final thing that we did, we actually developed an infographic and a poster, and we sent it to government and distributed it. So again, how to relay the key message that is sensitive and in a proper manner was really important. And that's what I drew on their expertise. So they were like, I'm really proud that they were involved in, you can see, like multiple levels in the development, in the inception and the KT. And even before I actually did the research project, I did a pre-research engagement session and opened it up to the general public and asked them the same questions.
Thank you. That's helpful. I really like your idea of a pre-research engagement session. I haven't thought of that in my own field or in my own work, and that's really like the time when people.
Public engagement has a grant for $10,000, and I actually got that grant to actually, you talk about teasing out, laying out the land and understand exactly what are the issues and where should my research go forward. So I used that pre-research activity in order to refine my question to go for the NL support grant. So that was, and I made lots of connections because when I was there, I must have had at least 30, I did across the island, and I had huge numbers of people showing up. And then during that, I said, hey, do you want to be involved in a research project as a member of the patient advisory committee? So I recruited people as well.
Oh, that sounds really clever. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate it.
Great questions. Any more? Oh, yep, Paul.
I just have another question about, you mentioned your work with the hard of hearing groups across the province. I'm working with people who stutter and have communication challenges in Newfoundland and Labrador. And this is just a personal aside, like how did you end up getting in touch with people? Because maybe it's just a different population. They respond to requests to speak with them differently. But we're having a difficult time getting people to come on board and be part of our research as well. We have a few within St. John's, but trying to reach people with communication challenges in different parts of the province has been very difficult for us.
So first place, and I don't know anything about this population. Like, where does this population access resources, or where does the issue is first noticed?
Yeah, it'd probably be through the school systems and independently through their own families. But I think the school systems would work with a speech pathologist there.
So that would be a good idea, through a speech pathologist, if you had someone like that to add on to your team. But
yeah, we do. Yeah.
A good idea is that you might want to do like a scientific cafe or open forum. Just really blitz it out there, like on VOCM and Facebook. Like I've been getting, and I am by no means like a tech savvy person, but I've been finding that I've used Facebook and Twitter.
Okay.
And that if you had an event, and even if you could get 5 people in there, and you could recruit 2 to help you, then you could use your snowballing. And I find like they have the insights of where to go, the know and the know. So I would, you can get the Quick Start funds to bring people together, do a scientific cafe, $2,500.
Yeah, I had that. Yeah.
And did you use it for?
We used it. We made new
event?
connections. We made new connections with it. But the population of people who stutter, who have communication disorders, is around 1% to 2% of the population. So it's a small group, and oftentimes it's difficult. There is a lot of avoidance of going to therapy and things like that. So it's just a kind of a group that's difficult to put your finger on, I think.
I would try social media.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I don't have much experience with people within that population, but I do know, like, vulnerable populations, quite often, if there's just something comes out on their view, quite often they access it in isolation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yep.
They don't want people to know that they're actually accessing something.
That's, I think, yeah, that'll have to do with it. Yeah. Yeah.
On
Okay.
social media, and I would do a open scientific cafe or an open webinar if they would go with that.
Okay. Great.
Or
Thank you.
to the schools, put posters to the schools, posters in the
Yep.
schools.
Okay. Okay.
Hmm.
So thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's really hard to get your target population, but I found that I learned a lot about accessing populations by where do they go to and where can you find them? You know, where do people congregate?
Hey, anybody else? Okay, I don't see any more questions. So thank you so much again for participating and everybody for the very good questions. And I guess we'll end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for coming. And if there's any questions, anyone can always reach out to me. I love talking to people about research and engaging in, public engagement. It's sort of my thing too. Thank you.
Thank you, April. Thanks.